Welcome to Fridays with a Forester. Today is March 14th, 2025. Today's topic is climate-ready woodlands, promoting the resilience of your backyard woodlands. And my name is Gary Wyatt, Extension Educator with our forestry team at the University of Minnesota Extension, and I'm based out of Mankato. Drew Weiner is our regional support staff in Grand Rapids, and he's helping moderate the webinar today as well. Today's topic is climate-ready woodlands, promoting the resilience of your backyard woodlands. Anna Stockstead is our extension educator in our forestry team, and she's leading our topic today. So traditional Zoom question and answers in the Q&A, please. We usually try and keep our Zoom sessions to an hour. We will try and answer all the questions that come up. And again, our recordings are recorded at the Z-link, z.umn.edu/Fridays. So enter your questions on the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Anna, I'm going to stop sharing and you can start sharing.
All right. Thank you, Gary. All right. Are you all seeing my screen?
Yes, full screen.
Perfect. Well, hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm really excited to be here with you today, and I'm also really excited to see some familiar names in the participant list today. So thank you all for taking time out of your morning to come and listen to me talk. I'm going to be talking about U of M Extension's Climate Ready Woodlands program. And the goal of this program is pretty much just to give you a toolbox of options to choose from that you can use to improve the resilience of your woodlands, regardless of if you own 1 or 2 acres of backyard woods or 200 plus acres of forested property. I'll be talking about some of the species recommendations we have through this program, as well as other general best practices for management strategies that you can use to improve the resilience of your forests. I want to shout out my team members who work on the Climate Ready Woodlands team. You all know Angie Gupta. She gave an amazing presentation on eco-anxiety a couple weeks ago. And then Emily Dombeck as well as our wonderful program coordinator. I want to give a big shout out to both of them. This is a really great collaborative effort between the three of us. So I just want to thank both of them and shout them out. So in terms of what we're going to be talking about today, first, I'm going to be talking about the climate change that we have observed in Minnesota and think about what this means for our forests and for our woodland stewardship decisions. I'll be talking about the Climate Ready Woodlands program, so going into those specific recommendations for trees and plants that you can use to improve the resilience of your woods. And then I'll be talking about these resilience best practices, and that's going to include enhancing diversity, and that can look like a lot of different forms of diversity. Talking about opening up growing space, and then also just very broadly thinking about promoting forest health. So to start off, I've already used the term resilience several times. So I want to start by defining what I mean by resilience in the context of our forests. So resilience in the context of forests is very similar to what it means to be a resilient human. Resilient forests are able to withstand a wide range of changing conditions. Forests are always getting curveballs thrown at them. So maybe they're getting a pest outbreak one year, followed by a drought year, maybe a few different changes in our winter conditions, like what we're having this year. These changes put stress on our forests, and a resilient forest is able to deal with that stress and still maintain its own functions and integrity as an ecosystem. But when we add in climate change as an additional layer of stress, that reduces the ability of forests to tolerate all of these changing conditions and changing extremes. So we want to think about how we can promote the resilience of our forests in the face of climate change so it's able to deal with this increased frequency of curveballs that are being thrown at our forests. So now I'm going to start by talking about the observed climate change that we have in Minnesota. And I often refer to this as ripping off the Band-Aid because it's not fun to talk about these observed climate trends. It can cause stress and anxiety. And I encourage you, if you weren't able to attend Angie's eco-anxiety webinar, I encourage you to go back and watch that. It's going to be on our YouTube playlist. So you can learn about some ways that you can process and deal with these feelings of eco-anxiety as a result of some of this observed climate change. So first, thinking about our temperature. So Minnesota, on average, is getting warmer. When we look at this data from the Minnesota DNR going all the way back to 1900, we can see that on average, our yearly temperatures are increasing. And of course, we're going to have a lot of seasonal variation. So we'll have some really mild summers, some really cold winters. We can see that variation here in the year-to-year observations. But when we take that average across time, across this long period of time since 1900, we can see this average increase in our yearly temperature. And I think it's really important here to differentiate between weather and climate. So I like to use this analogy where weather is similar to the outfit that we choose to put on every day. There's going to be a lot of variation in the outfit that we're wearing day to day, depending on what the weather looks like that day, what we're up to that day, etc. But climate, still using the same analogy, climate is like the entire wardrobe of clothes. So it's this big picture snapshot across time, looking at all of our clothes in the wardrobe. So that's why it's really important that we zoom out beyond the seasonal variation and we look at this trend across time and we can see the temperature warming up. We can see this temperature change manifested in the USDA plant hardiness zones, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with if you're a gardener, if you're planting trees, or whatever you're doing out in your woods. In 2023, the USDA released these new plant hardiness zone maps. And I want to compare here the 2006 map to the 2023 map. And let's look right in the middle part of the state, looking at that purple, which is zone 4A. We can see that zone 4A has expanded and moved northward. So we can see those warming temperatures moving north in the state. And also that coldest zone, that light pinkish purple, zone 3A, has shifted almost entirely northwards out of Minnesota, except for some small parts of St. Louis County and Koochiching County. So again, this is a manifestation of those warming temperatures because we can see these hardiness zones shifting northwards as our climate warms. So we're seeing these changes in our average yearly temperature, but we're also getting changes in our precipitation, so the amount of rainfall and snow that we're getting per year. And again, when we look at that trend across time, going back to 1900, we can see an increase, albeit a slightly smaller increase in our precipitation since 1900, with a lot of seasonal variability. But when we take that big average across time over these last 100 plus years, we can see our precipitation increasing across the state. But the dynamics of how this precipitation is actually occurring isn't just more consistent rainfall across the year. Instead, we're getting more frequent extreme precipitation events. So these are precipitation events where we're getting a lot of rainfall during a short period of time. And these large precipitation events can have negative impacts on our ecosystems and our communities and infrastructure because these big rainfall events cause erosion, which can impact water quality. It can be too stressful for culverts and roads and other infrastructure, et cetera. So it is something to be thinking about as we're thinking about forest resilience in the context of these large precipitation events, knowing that we're going to have an increased risk for erosion. And between these larger extreme precipitation events, we're also getting longer periods of drought. So as I'm sure many of us are familiar with from experiencing over these last several years, our last 4 or 5 growing seasons, we have had drought conditions. Pretty much up until this last growing season in 2024, we did get above average rainfall in the beginning and middle part of the growing season, and then we started to decline into a drought going forward into the fall. So what this means is that we're jumping between two different extremes. We're jumping between these large precipitation events and then going all the way over to the other extreme of drought. And those extremes, when we're jumping back and forth between those extremes, that causes stress on our trees and our forests. So that's why it's really important to think about improving the resilience of our forests to these changing conditions and to these changing extremes. And now thinking about winter conditions. So we've definitely had some weird winters in the last several years, especially the winter of 2023 to 2024, where it was warm and we barely got any snow. This winter has felt a little bit more normal than usual, or at least compared to the last couple of winters, but we've still had a lot of variability. I'm in Duluth, and it's been really sunny and warm these last few days, but we're getting a lot of variability between cold temperatures and warm temperatures and cold again. But this chart here is showing the change in our average winter temperatures. And we can see those average winter temperatures increasing again across time, taking this long-term average. And we can also see the 10 warmest winters on record occurring in the last couple of decades here in Minnesota. So again, here we can see our winters getting warmer, and this has impacts on the frost in our forests and our snow dynamics, which is a whole nother topic, which could be a whole nother presentation. But just important to note here is that our winters, we have observed them getting warmer. So putting together all this observed climate change and now thinking about what this means for our forests. So in Minnesota, we are really lucky to have four unique biomes coming together in our state. So we have the wonderful prairies on the western part of the state. We have our tall grass aspen parkland, the boreal forest, which is shown here as the coniferous forest, and then the eastern broadleaf forest, which is shown here as the deciduous forest. So these four unique biomes coming together. And I specifically want to point out that the boreal forest, the southern range of the boreal forest is extending into Minnesota. So what this means is that the southern limit of the boreal forest, that is going to be at the highest risk or the highest sensitivity to these changing climate conditions, because it's already at the southern range of of its normal climatic conditions. So as those temperatures change, as precipitation changes, the ecosystems along that southern end of the boreal forest are just going to be more sensitive to those changes, which is why, again, it's important that we're thinking about how can we improve the resilience of our forests to keep the boreal forest and all the other biomes and ecosystems in our state healthy and resilient for the long term. And so that brings us to the Climate Ready Woodlands program. So we created this Climate Ready Woodlands program because we were hearing the need from people like you, people who care for forests across the state. We heard the need from you all that you wanted recommendations for how you can improve the resilience and climate readiness of your forests, regardless of if, again, you own 1 or 2 acres or a couple hundred acres of wooded property. So the Climate Ready Woodlands program is broken up regionally. So we've broken up the state into 11 different ecoregions, which you can see here on the map. And for each of these ecoregions, we have 3 different recommendation lists, as well as participatory science projects for each of these lists, or for each of these ecoregions, which I'll be talking more about at the end of this presentation. So for each of the ecoregions, we have a list of climate-ready native tree species. So these are native tree species that are predicted to be more resilient to the changing climate. There are also native trees to consider for climate refugia. So these are species that may be more vulnerable to climate change or to forest health risks. So it's important that we are caring for them using maybe some slightly different strategies to keep them healthy and resilient on the landscape, regardless of their vulnerability to climate change or other concerns. And then we also have lists of native understory plants for all of the ecoregions that are both climate resilient and provide benefits for many species of critters that we know and love. So thinking about birds, pollinators, other insects, small mammals, etc. And as we were creating these lists, we also documented those critter benefits for all of our species of trees as well. And we are working on getting all of these species uploaded into the Plant Elements of Design database, which is run by the U of M Extension horticulture team. And that's going to house all of this great information about these wildlife benefits. So in today's presentation, I'm just going to be highlighting one of these ecoregions. If you want to go and explore this information in more detail and go find the list for your ecoregion specifically, here's this link, which I'm hoping someone will drop into the chat, as well as a QR code if you just want to pop your phone out and scan that as well. And I'll have that QR code up over the next several slides so that you can access it. So before I get into the content of these lists, I want to first talk about how we developed these lists in the first place. So we used a research-based methodology where we brought together data from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and the USDA Forest Service Climate Change Tree Atlas. So we brought together this modeled climate tree species vulnerability data. We looked at all of the tree species and all of the native forested plant communities of the state. We combined all this data, and at the end, we separated species into two different buckets. So there's that refugia category. Like I said, these are species that, based on our methodology, were predicted to be more vulnerable to the changing climate, or they had a critical forest health concern. So these are pests or diseases that uh, impact an entire population of trees. So these are insects like emerald ash borer or diseases like butternut canker that have these widespread devastating impacts on our tree species. If species had that critical forest health threat, they were automatically moved into the refugia category. And for any tree species that didn't have that forest health concern or that critical forest health concern, and they did better in terms of climate resilience, they were moved into this climate ready category. For our plants, we had to do something different because our wonderful native understory plants are a little bit more understudied and they don't necessarily have this climate vulnerability data. So instead, we looked at the native range of all of our native plants in our forests in Minnesota. And if a native plant species has a range that extends far to the east and to the south of Minnesota, we considered it to be climate resilient because its native range already covers a wide range of climatic conditions. And then, like I mentioned before, we documented all of those wildlife associations for all of these native plants because we recognize that all these plants serve so many functions in the forest and provide so many benefits to wildlife and other beings. And so we want to honor that in our methodology. Okay, so now getting into these examples. So when you navigate to that QR code or to the link, it's going to bring you to this landing page for the Climate Ready Woodlands program. We have a lot of great information here. So I'll be clicking into the recommended trees for climate ready woodlands to bring up our species recommendation list. We also have information on context related to that forest refugia. So the creating refugia to protect species that are a little bit more vulnerable to climate change. We talk broadly about assisted migration, invasive species, and just general woodland stewardship strategies. But today I'm going to be clicking here into the recommendations tab. And when we do that, you're going to see links to all of the 11 ecoregions. So for you, you would just want to find where approximately you think you're located within these ecoregions to the best of your ability. For some folks, you might be straddling two different ecoregions, and that's okay. I encourage you just to look at both of the lists and pick and choose what you would like. But for today, I'm going to be highlighting ecoregion 3 right here in the central part of the state, thinking around the Brainerd area. So clicking into ecoregion 3, when we go into those ecoregion pages, we're going to have a lot of great context related to the landscape and geologic history of this region. And when we scroll down, we're going to see recommendations first for those climate ready tree species. So here, this is the list of those climate ready tree species for ecoregion 3. And this is a really familiar cast of characters. We see several different maple species that we know and love. We see bitternut hickory. We see some conifers like tamarack, white spruce, black spruce, white pine, some oaks. Really great variety for us to choose from. So these are species that, based on our methodology, are predicted to be more resilient to a changing climate. And it's really important here to recognize too that the red oaks on this list, specifically northern pin oak and northern red oak, those are more susceptible to oak wilt, which is just depending on where you are in this ecoregion, a little bit further away from the oak wilt range, but it's good to be aware of, which is something I'll be talking about more later on. And then our American elm recommendation at the bottom, we want to make sure that we're purchasing disease-resistant elm since elms are susceptible to Dutch elm disease. So just some important things to be aware of. And on the website, all of these lists also have information on soil and light preferences. So that can help you make some more decisions related to which species you want to be planting in your woods. But regardless of which species you choose to plant or to encourage through natural regeneration in your woods, I really encourage you to promote a mix of species based on your goals and based on the site. Diversity is key, and I'll be talking more about this later on, but having a good diversity of tree species is really essential for long-term resilience. So I encourage you to choose a few different species depending on what you're able to access at the nursery, for example. I encourage you to experiment and see what you like in terms of these species. It's also really important to match the species to the site. Because if we're planting the wrong species on the wrong site, of course it's not going to do well, even if it's predicted to be climate resilient. So this is where I encourage you to also work with a forester or another natural resource professional to make these more site-specific decisions and using that soil and light preference information to help fine-tune which species you want to be planting in your woods. And also a big influence on what you're going to actually be able to plant is what you're able to purchase through trade. So some of these species are going to be more easily accessible through your soil and water conservation district, for example, through a local nursery. So really what you're able to buy is going to be a big factor that influences what you're actually able to plant. So now thinking about those refugia species. So these species that are predicted to be a little bit more vulnerable to the changing climate or critical forest health concerns. So on this list, we see our 3 species of native ash trees. And what's sad is that these ash species, they did pretty well in terms of climate resilience in most of the ecoregions. But because of emerald ash borer, which is an invasive pest that kills ash trees, those ash species had to be moved over to this refugia list. But ash species provide tremendous cultural and ecological value. So just because they're threatened by EAB doesn't necessarily mean that we should just stop caring about them. We need to think about how we can keep them healthy in the long term, how we can help diversify those ash ecosystems in preparation for EAB, which is a whole nother topic. But I just want to recognize that here. We also see a couple of our native pines, jack pine and red pine. And you may have noticed that white pine was on the climate ready list. So white pine, eastern white pine, has a very large range that extends far across the eastern US. Jack pine and red pine, their ranges are coming to their southern and western limit here in Minnesota. So they're going to be a little bit more sensitive to that change in climate. So when we're thinking about these refugia species, we're not only thinking about what species may be more vulnerable and how can we protect them, but we can also think about areas, so physical geographic locations that will be more buffered from the impacts of climate change. These are areas such as north-facing slopes, which are naturally cooler and more moist than south-facing slopes, for example. Wetter sites, so thinking about lowlands, bogs, clay-rich soils, those soils that have a higher moisture content are going to be less at risk to drought impacts. So those are great opportunities to create these refugia areas to buffer those impacts of our warming temperatures and drought. And also about those refugia areas, anywhere along the North Shore is great because Lake Superior does an amazing job of buffering the climate, keeping it cooler and a little bit more humid along the shore. So that's a great space for these refugia areas as well. But regardless of which species we are planting, protecting, encouraging, again, I want to bring us back to focusing in on that species diversity, not putting all of our eggs in one basket. And we can also promote the health of individual trees and our forests as a whole by opening up growing space and reducing competition, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. And then improving forest health, which I'll be talking about more as well. So thinking about how to prevent invasion by EAB, preventing the spread, preventing infestation by other diseases and insects, for example. All right, and now thinking about those climate-ready native plants. So these are those native understory plants and shrubs, which are going to be more resilient to climate change. And so again, we see a very familiar list of species here. If we were to walk out in the woods in this area of the state in the middle of the summer, we would see a lot of these species. So we see some shrubs, including 2 species of hazelnut, which provide great food for wildlife and a lot of other benefits. We see some other familiar species like Canada mayflower and Virginia ground cherry, smooth wild rose, etc. So lots of different options to choose from here. So with these, you can really focus in on promoting the native plants that you already have on site. You can also think about planting these native plants, and you can purchase native plants through your soil and water conservation district or through native plant suppliers. But usually the biggest barrier to having a diversity of native plants on site is invasive species. So for some of you, the first step to encouraging more native plants in the understory is going to be removing these invasive species, whether that's buckthorn or tansy, whatever it may be. Usually that is the first step to promoting a better diversity of understory plants if you have these invasive species on site. Okay, so I walked us through these recommendations for this ecoregion specifically. And again, I encourage you to click around on our website and find which ecoregion you're located in and look at the recommendations for your area of the state. Now I'm going to be talking about how you can actually apply this toolbox of recommendations in your woods. So first of all, you may be wondering, what is the number one best approach to improving the resilience of your woods? And as is usually the case, the answer is it depends. There are several different approaches that you can take, and it all depends on your goals and your values and what you want your woodland to look like in the future. So as you're making a plan for how you want to go about improving the resilience of your woods, I want you to ask yourself a few questions. What are your goals for your woodland? What about your woodland do you most value? Are you an avid bird watcher? Do you really enjoy foraging and collecting non-timber forest products? Are you a hunter? What do you most value? How do you connect with your woods? What do you want your woodland to look like in the future? Do you want to change it to something that looks different from what it is now? Maybe you have a red pine plantation and you want to help promote some more diversity in your woods. Maybe you have a forest, a beautiful maple basswood forest that you want to protect and keep it looking like how it is today for as long as possible. So what do you want your woodland to look like in the future? And when we're talking about making stewardship decisions in the context of climate change and our changing conditions, it's important to recognize the risk and uncertainty. So how do you know that the trees that you plant will actually survive with climate change? And it's also important here to define what we mean by risk. And risk can take several different forms. It can be the risk of management practices not necessarily not working as expected. So maybe you go in and you thin your red pine stand and the trees don't respond to thinning in the way that you expected. This is an example of risk. There's the risk of financial losses. Maybe you go in and you plant a whole lot of white pine and white cedar and it all gets browsed by a deer and there goes your investment in those seedlings. There's the risk of unexpected disturbances such as flooding or drought. These things can happen and they can be difficult to predict. And so that's one example of risk. And there's also the risk of unintended impacts to other species or other parts of the ecosystem. Any decision that we make, including doing nothing, is going to have some impact on some other part of the ecosystem. So what's most important is that we are just making the best decisions that we can with the best information that we have for caring for our forests in the long term. So we can only do our best, and that's all that matters. But we just need to recognize that anything that we do, including doing nothing, is going to have some impact on some part of the ecosystem. And so we just need to embrace this uncertainty and just recognize that our forests are complex systems. And so at the end of the day, all of this really comes together as don't put all of your eggs in one basket. I encourage you to diversify the species that you're planting. I encourage you to diversify the stewardship actions that you're implementing and just experiment and tinker in your woods. Just growing season to growing season, just working away at it and seeing what works. Okay, so now finally getting into these best practices for resilience. I've already mentioned this several times, but my number one best practice for improving resilience is enhancing diversity. And diversity comes in several different forms. First, we have species diversity. So this is just having multiple different kinds of trees and plants on your site. And you can do this through a few different means. If we have a little bit of a larger property, we can promote a diversity of tree species by harvesting in gaps of varying sizes. So taking out gaps of trees to change up our light conditions and promote different tree species that have different shade tolerances. And I'll be providing an example of this on an upcoming slide. We also have age class diversity, so different ages of trees across your forest. So as trees age, they provide different benefits and functions. They serve different roles throughout their lifetime. So it's really important that we have these different ages of trees across our site. And again, we can do this by removing or harvesting individual trees or gaps of trees at different stages of their lifetime so that those trees will grow back or they will regenerate, or if we're planting trees, that they will create this different age class distribution across the site. There's also structural diversity, and this is especially important when we're thinking about wildlife. So this structural diversity is if we were to look out in our woods and we can see a diversity in terms of our vertical structure in the forest. So we have different sizes and shapes of trees. And this also includes leaving behind some dead trees. So snags are those dead standing trees. They provide great wildlife benefits for cavity nesters and other species. There are also wolf trees, which usually have poor form, so they wouldn't necessarily be good for timber, but they provide a ton of ecological value for wildlife. So these are these really large, scraggly looking trees. They provide great habitat for wildlife and will have cascading positive impacts on biodiversity. Going into a little bit more detail on the importance of diversity. So when we have diverse trees and plants, this is going to support a diversity of insects, small mammals and birds, all the way up to our larger predators like eagles in this example. So when we have a diversity of trees and plants, this creates a strong foundation for the rest of the ecosystem and supports biodiversity of other species as well. So this diversity just helps to create redundancy in our forest, and that leads to long-term stability and resilience. And part of my background is in forest soils, and I'm a big soils nerd, so I always really like to highlight that when we have biodiversity above ground, this supports biodiversity below ground in our soil biota as well. And this is a whole ecosystem within itself. There are so many different organisms living within our soil, and when we have biodiverse soil, this directly benefits our above ground ecosystems as well. Okay, so now I want to give an example of what I mean by harvesting in gaps to help change up the light conditions in our forests and promote a diversity of species and tree ages in our forest. So let's consider here in this pine stand, we took out this gap of trees. What happens here when we take out this gap? Suddenly, we open up a whole lot of light now in this gap. And this is going to promote the shade intolerant tree species growing back in. So these are species that prefer a lot of light when they're young and when they're just starting off. So this is going to promote the species diversity where we have the shade intolerant species growing back in the gaps, as well as shade tolerant species surrounding the gaps in what we call the matrix. So changing up these light conditions mimics the impacts of natural disturbance like wind throw or disease outbreaks, for example, by changing up these light conditions and creating these pockets of open growing space. And when we harvest in gaps, we not only get tree species regenerating in the gaps, but we also get a lot of native plants and shrubs growing back as well. And all of these species that are regenerating in these gaps provide great benefits for our pollinators as well. So we're going to have a whole lot of pollinators coming and utilizing these gaps. So this is a great way to mix up the species diversity, age class diversity in our forests just by harvesting in these gaps. And when we change up the shapes of the gaps, so maybe it's a little bit more oblong, this increases the amount of edge along the gaps, which is great for wildlife because a lot of wildlife like to go back and forth between the interior of the forest to the gap and back again. So this helps promote that wildlife diversity as well. So I've mentioned this term already, the idea of growing space. And growing space is just the resources, so light, water, and nutrients, as well as the physical space that trees need to grow. So when we open up growing space, we are making sure that those trees and that the forest stand as a whole has the resources that it needs to be healthy and resilient. So we can manage this growing space to help promote this long-term health and resilience. And so when we think about growing space specifically for native plants, as I mentioned before, usually the biggest barrier to these native plants being able to establish and expand in the forest, usually that biggest barrier are those invasive species. So by working away at mitigating and removing invasive species, if you have them on site, is really important for opening up growing space for our native plants so that those understory plants can be happy and healthy. You may also have some trees that we call suppressed. So these suppressed trees are overtopped by other trees, so they don't have any light that they're accessing in the canopy. They're stressed, they're not doing as well. We can remove some of those trees through thinning so that we're opening up growing space for the rest of the trees in that stand. But it's also good sometimes to leave behind some of these suppressed trees because those trees will eventually die and then become snags. So those dead standing trees that provide a lot of wildlife value. But we can think about, just in the context of growing space, we can think about removing some of these suppressed trees to make sure that the rest of the trees in the stand have access to the growing space that they need. You may also be thinking about planting some seedlings. Those seedlings also need growing space in order to establish. So if you have a really thick shrub layer or you're getting a lot of aspen sprouts regenerating, you may be thinking about trying to open up growing space for those tree seedlings by removing that shrub or aspen layer. If you're thinking about doing that, it's also important to think about if habitat goals are one part of your stewardship plan, because the shrub layer and those aspen sprouts provide great wildlife value as well for specific species such as grouse. Shrubs such as hazelnut provide food for wildlife. So when you're making the stewardship plan, just think about if habitat goals are one of your priorities if you're wanting to remove some of these shrubs or aspen sprouts. If you want to cut back on that shrub layer a little bit, you can do that through mechanical or chemical control, so using herbicides, depending on what your goals are and what you're comfortable with. And when we're thinning out the shrub layer, this does mimic the impacts of natural disturbance like fire. So those low intensity ground fires would naturally thin out that shrub layer and help open up growing space in the understory for tree seedlings to establish and regenerate, as well as other species of understory plants. So thinking about growing space, I just want to quickly highlight that trees allocate energy to growth differently. So they have a priority list of what they put their energy towards. So first, they're always going to prioritize maintenance. So making sure that they have their water pumping up and down their bowl, that they're transporting nutrients. They're going to prioritize that maintenance first. They're also going to prioritize putting on seeds and cones because their number one goal is to survive and reproduce. This is also really important that trees will always prioritize growing up before they grow wider. So they're going to prioritize this height growth over their diameter growth. Then they'll prioritize root growth so they can make sure they are getting the water and nutrients that they need. And then once those needs are met, then they can finally breathe and put on some diameter growth. So key takeaway here is that trees want to grow up before they grow out. And this is going to be important here that I'm in just an upcoming slide. And then also depending on what the tree is dealing with at the time, maybe they're fighting off bark beetles or spruce budworm, maybe they have armillaria root rot. They'll prioritize putting energy towards defending themselves from those diseases and insects, depending on what they're dealing with at the time. So that defense mechanism can go up and down on their priority list. But at the end of the day, a resilient tree is able to allocate its resources across all of these different needs. And so we want to make sure that each tree has the growing space that it needs so that it can meet all of its own growth priorities. It can have the resources and physical space that it needs to grow. So this is why opening up growing space is really important so that we can make sure our trees are allocating resources appropriately. And here's an example of what it means when we're opening up growing space through thinning specifically. We can see the life history of a tree just by looking at its tree rings. So when we look at the center of the tree at the pith and move out a little bit further, we can see that those tree rings here are very small. They're very narrow growth rings. So that means that that tree is not growing a lot. Because remember, the tree is always going to prioritize vertical growth before that horizontal or diameter growth. So when it's not able to prioritize diameter growth, it's going to have these smaller growth rings. But in this example, the land stewards went in and implemented a thinning. So they removed some of the trees in order to open up growing space for the rest of the stand. And when they went in and thinned out that stand, suddenly this tree was able to access the growing space it needed. It was able to breathe and put on some diameter growth finally. And that's where we can see this big increase in the size of those growth rings. So this is really a good example of what it means to open up growing space so that tree can be resilient and allocate its resources appropriately. So now coming towards the end of this presentation, I just also want to quickly highlight and summarize the importance of promoting forest health. So trees and forests are always going to be facing some type of forest health, I wouldn't say issue, but they're always dealing with some insect eating on the buds or boring underneath the bark, or they're going to be dealing with some disease. There are so many native insects and diseases that impact our forests, and most of those are totally fine for the forest to deal with. But where we really want to be aware and cognizant is thinking about these invasive or non-native insects and diseases such as emerald ash borer or oak wilt. So we want to make sure we're proactively monitoring and just being aware that these issues exist and keeping an eye out for it in the woods. When we're thinking about some of the native forest health issues that can impact our forests, a couple of examples that I like to highlight is spruce budworm first. So spruce budworm feeds on our white spruce and balsam fir. A good way to reduce the impacts of spruce budworm in our forests is by reducing the density of balsam fir, which is the #1 food source for spruce budworm. So by reducing the density of balsam fir in our forests, we can help to reduce that impact of spruce budworm if you're located in an area that has spruce budworm. Also, red pine, they are fed on by bark beetles. We can go in and thin red pine stands to make sure that each of those trees has the growing space that it needs. And by doing so, we can help to reduce the impacts of bark beetle damage. And just like I said before at the start of this slide, making sure that we're being aware of these emerging non-native forest health threats, such as emerald ash borer and oak wilt. And U of M Extension, as well as the Department of Natural Resources, has management recommendations for both of these issues. So I won't be going into a ton of detail here just due to time, but I just want to quickly highlight that we need to be aware of this. Okay, so I've talked a lot about planting trees. Where can you get tree seedlings? First, soil and water conservation districts are a great place for getting trees and plants. They sell tree seedlings in smaller bundles, so thinking 20 to 25 seedlings. You can get seedlings through the DNR State Forest Nursery as well, but those are going to come in much larger bundles, which may not be feasible for you if you don't want to go out and plant a 100 plus trees, for example. And there are also nonprofits such as Let's Plant Trees that provide free plant seedlings as well. So I've talked a lot about what you can do to improve the resilience of your woods, but as I wrap this up, I also want to highlight that the #1 most important thing that you can do as a woodland steward is just to keep your forest as a forest. We want to prevent converting a forest to something that's not a forest, so a housing development or a parking lot. So just by keeping your forest as a forest, you're having huge positive impacts. And it's even better if you can be an active caretaker in your woods and implement some of these stewardship strategies that I discussed. Okay, so now for key takeaways. At the very beginning of this presentation, we talked about that observed climate change, about how Minnesota is on average getting warmer, wetter, and experiencing these changes in extremes. #1 takeaway as well to think about today is that a diverse ecosystem is a resilient ecosystem. We want to promote this diversity in our forest for long-term resilience. The Climate Ready Woodlands program is a toolbox for you to use to improve the resilience of your woods, regardless of the size of your property. We have lists for all of these 11 ecoregions in Minnesota of both native trees and plants. And you have a ton of options that you can implement to improve the resilience of your woods. If you want to get more involved in the Climate Ready Woodlands program, I really encourage you to check out the participatory science projects, which are run by my colleague Angie Gupta, who is also on the webinar here today. 3 of these are related to the Climate Ready Woodlands program. And with these projects, we are looking at finding species that may not be currently native to Minnesota. They're what we would call near native. So maybe they're native just a little bit south or to the east of Minnesota, but they could potentially do well in Minnesota's future climate. So we want to see if any of these species are on the landscape already, if people are already caring for these trees, and if so, how they're doing. Are they being browsed by any wildlife, etc. So I encourage you to check out these projects and get involved. All right, I just want to give again a big thank you to both Angie and Emily and all the reviewers that have been involved in this project. And with that, I'll say thank you to all of you for coming and listening to me today. Here is our contact information. You can see mine there in the middle. So I'm based in Cloquet. Angie and Emily's contact info are both located there as well. And if you'd like to give feedback, we have an anonymous feedback form linked here as well. And we would greatly appreciate any feedback that you have on the program. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. So thank you all.
And a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. And I think we'll keep your slide set up just in case
Okay.
you have to go back to answer some questions. Angie's been very active in answering some of these questions. Angie, shall we ask Anna? I'd really like her answer on this one that talks about the migration or southern type of plants. Let me ask this question for you, ask this question for Anna. Probably not as relevant to Minnesota, but if Minnesota starts moving trees from southern states, will the southern states bring fauna or flora from places in Central America? So basically just shifting everything further north.
So to clarify, it sounds like that question is asking like if like central and southern US species shift northwards, will even more southerly wildlife species also shift up? Is that what the question was?
I think it's just looking at the plants, pretty much.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, that's one of the questions that we're trying to answer through the participatory science projects. So thinking about as these tree and plant species are shifting northwards, whether they are assisted by humans or much more slowly moving on their own through natural dispersion, we're really interested in knowing if wildlife and fauna in general are also shifting with those tree species. So those are questions that we're trying to ask of the participatory science programs. And I also didn't really highlight it here today, but a core tenet of the Climate Ready Woodlands program is the concept of rewilding. So this idea that it's very similar to restoration, but instead we are thinking about promoting more future adapted, forward-looking ecosystems that are adapted to a future climate and focused on promoting biodiversity in our faunal species as well. So thinking about those tree and plant and wildlife associations and making those forward-looking. So I would say we're trying to answer that question. I think it's definitely possible that as species shift, that wildlife species will also shift with them. But I think that's something we need to learn more about. And yeah.
Great. Thanks, Anna. Let me skip down to the questions that are not answered by Angie. Do you think that this long-term changing landscape will have a positive or negative impact on our state's tourism of promoting the Northern Woods lake appeal in the future?
Really great question. So from the data that I've seen, I mean, I think that the Northwoods are going to be resilient. We have a great diversity of tree species, and the North Shore does a great job of buffering the climate. So even though it's the southern end of the boreal forest, I think it's going to be looking like the boreal forest for a while. It's not going to be like suddenly those trees just disappear. There could be some gradual changes in species composition, but I think that the Northwoods are going to stay looking as the Northwoods, especially if we continue to care for them in the long term. It's just thinking about potential changes in species composition. So in terms of impacts on tourism, I am definitely not a tourism expert at all. But I would say that as long as we're being active caretakers in the woods and caring for the forest, like we um, for long-term resilience. I don't foresee any major negative impacts, but again, I'm not an expert, but I just know that the Northwoods should be resilient going forward in the future with active stewardship.
Thanks, Anna. There's another question here. Where is Let's Plant Trees program located, and who is their target audience? Let's Plant Trees.
Yes, so the two people who run Let's Plant Trees, I believe they're located in northeastern Minnesota. I think that most of Minnesota, I don't want to speak incorrectly for them, but I think that their entire audience is all of Minnesota, maybe more targeted towards northern Minnesota, but they provide Minnesota native trees. Um, and so maybe if we can drop the link to their website, people can explore that program in more detail. But they are run by two people in northeastern Minnesota. They were both enrolled in a program of mine. So they are local folks.
Okay, great. You have a question on no basswood or paper birch recommended in pine moraine ecosystems.
So I don't have that the basswood like at the top of my mind, but paper birch and several of the northern ecosystems was a little bit more borderline in terms of climate resilience, and that resulted in it falling into the refugia category. So it maybe had a climate resilience score just slightly less, or it was just a little bit more vulnerable to climate change, and so it fell into that refugia category. And basswood, I'd have to pull up that data right now in terms of to see where it fell in terms of climate resilience. But each of the ecoregions is going to have different recommendations in terms of tree species, just based off of the climate vulnerability in that area and the different site conditions, et cetera.
Okay, thanks, Anna. Emily just posted the Let's Plant Trees website, and another
Thank you.
comment or question actually says, unfortunately, Let's Plant Trees is out of stock for 2025. So maybe you put in your order for next year if or 2026. And I think that's all the questions. Anna, let's see. As Angie and Emily, please type pipe in here if you have any other questions or questions that I missed, maybe. I think the rest of the questions were answered by Angie or Emily.
Yeah, so we were just marking those as ready to be answered by Anna, so I'll
Oh,
give
okay.
one. We have someone asking if they only have 1 acre of woodland, how large should the gaps be that they leave?
So if you have 1 acre of woodland, you could just think about taking out, and it kind of depends on the density of trees that you have already in your woodland, but you can think about taking out, individual trees if they're suppressed, for example, taking out those individual trees. That'll still create a small gap, still change up the light conditions in that gap, and mimic the natural disturbance. So obviously, like in a 1 acre woodland, it's going to be hard to do a quarter-acre gap just because you don't have a whole lot of a whole lot of acreage to work with. But you could think about taking out some of those individual trees that may be suppressed, not doing as well, so you can open up growing space for the rest of the trees on that acre.
Another question here. Thanks, Emily. Is it okay to plant in the fall or is spring preferable? I need to more time to remove invasives.
Really great question. And I guess it's kind of hard to say depending on what type of invasives you're dealing with and where you're located in the state, and what the site is like. It also kind of depends on the conditions in the spring too. If we're getting a lot of freeze and thaw like we are right now, or really wet conditions. Um, and maybe Gary, I know you were just doing some tree planting, and maybe you can
Yes,
provide some insight on this because you've had very recent hands-on work with
sure.
that. So I don't know if you want to provide your insight there.
Sure, just yesterday. Of course, I'm in southern Minnesota. I'm St. James, but near Mankato. But I just planted some spruce trees yesterday. It had to dig through a little bit of frost, not too much, but they're in 6-inch pots, so they're not very deep. That I need to dig the hole very deep. But yeah, planted them before the rain coming in tonight. So wherever you can, if you and control invasives, and if then that invasive species area is open for planting, then do it either spring or fall, I'd say. And then there's one more question here. Is Extension able to provide one-to-one assistance to help a landowner make management decisions specific to their site or property?
Really great question. So, like me and Angie, Gary, we don't do that one-on-one site assistance, but Extension does have local extension educators. So, local agriculture and natural resource educators that are located in many of the counties across the state. So, you could just look up your local extension office and see if they have a local educator on site to provide you that more site-specific guidance. that's a great person to go to. Also, your Soil and Water Conservation District is another great option to go to for that one-on-one assistance, as well as the Department of Natural Resources. They have private forest management foresters. So those foresters can provide that one-on-one site guidance as well. So you have a few different options for people to go to.
Very good, Anna. Will limbing up my trees help when you can't make gaps?
Another
Will,
great question.
okay.
Another great question. So it depends on the type of tree, but for different hardwood species, and also many species self-prune. When they're younger and growing, they'll self-prune off some of their branches. But yes, depending on what type of tree you're working with, removing some of those lower limbs can help change up the light conditions. That's really important for white pine. If you're dealing with white pine blister rust, is to prune off some of those lower branches just to increase airflow. And help limit the spread of that fungus. So yes, it could definitely be a great option to help change up light conditions depending on the tree.
Here's one more question. What about genetics? Isn't there a difference within species that would encourage using stock from near rather than far?
Yes, absolutely. Genetics is a big part of it, and I didn't touch on that today. Having genetic diversity in a forest is just as important as having species diversity and other types of diversity. In terms of genetics, thinking about the like local or far away genetics, yes, definitely prioritizing those local and more close genetics is key, because if you're planting, for example, white pine from the far southern end of its range, so like thinking more towards the eastern and central US, planting a more southerly white pine stock all the way up in Coochin County, it's going to grow differently just because that genetic stock has adapted to different climatic conditions. So genetics is a key factor there. And there are guidelines online about transporting genetics. And that's an example of what we would call assisted population migration, where we're moving genetic stock of a species within its range. So moving that more southerly white pine further north, that would be an example of moving that genetic stock. So that's a great question and something I didn't even go into today. So thank you for asking that.
Anna, if you could stop sharing, I'll close with a few
Okay.
other slides, and we thank participants for coming today. Anna, what a wonderful presentation today. Excellent job. If you want to reach Anna, I've got her email address on there. Anna's from the Cloquet office and are part of our forestry team in Extension. Again, all of our recordings are recorded on our Z link, z.umn.edu/Fridays. And as you leave today, you'll have an evaluation, but next week is going to be Agroforestry Grants and Practices by Tyler Carlson and Caleb Langworthy. Again, there'll be a short evaluation as you leave today's presentation. Again, these email addresses, if you're not part of our newsletter, our My Minnesota Woods newsletter that comes out monthly, you can access it by accessing that Z link that's on the screen. And again, all of our recordings for Fridays with the Forester are recording on our Fridays Z link. We thank you very much for attending. Also, thanks Drew, Emily, and Angie, and Anna for presenting today and participating in today's webinar. Thank you very much.